It's my great honor today to introduce to you one of the greatest thinkers of our age, Herbert Marcuse. Herbert Marcuse is a very modest man. He really doesn't believe he's very important at all. But I think every word he's written, I won't go through the catalogues of his works, Eros and Civilization, One-Dimensional Man, disproves the modesty that he protests. And I think every sentence he utters today will also disprove that. I'd like to introduce to you Herbert Marcuse.
I'm very happy to see so many flowers here, and that is why I want to remind you that flowers by themselves have no power whatsoever other than the power of men and women who protect them and take care of them against aggression and destruction. As a hopeless philosopher, for whom philosophy has become inseparable from politics, I'm afraid I have to give here today a rather philosophical speech, and I must ask your indulgence for it. We are dealing with the dialectic of liberation, actually redundant, because I believe that all dialectic is liberation, and not only liberation in an intellectual sense, but liberation involving the mind and the body, liberation involving the entire human existence. Think of Plato, the liberation from the existence in the cave. Think of Hegel, liberation in the sense of progress and freedom on a historical scale. Think of Marx. Now, in what sense is all dialectic? In the liberation. It is liberation from a repressive, from a bad, from a false system. Be it an organic system, be it a social system, being a mental or intellectual system. Liberation by forces developing within such a system. That is a decisive point. And liberation by virtue of the contradictions generated by the system, precisely because it is a bad, a false system. I'm using intentionally here moral, philosophical terms, values, bad, false. For without the objectively justifiable goal of a better, a free human existence, all liberation must remain meaningless, at best progress in servitude. And even that, I admit, is worth fighting for. I believe that in Marx too, socialism ought to be. This ought belongs to the very essence of scientific socialism. It ought to be. It is, we may almost say, a biological, sociological, and political necessity. A biological necessity inasmuch as a socialist society, according to Marx, would conform with the very logos of life, with the essential possibilities of a human existence, not only mentally, not only intellectually, but also organically. Now, as to today and our own situation, I think we are faced with a novel situation in history, because today we have to be liberated from a relatively well-functioning, rich, powerful society. I'm speaking here, and my main topic, as you know, is liberation from the affluent societies, that is to say, the advanced industrial societies. We are facing the problem, we are facing the need for liberation, not from a poor society, not from a disintegrating society, not even in most cases from a terroristic society, but from a society which develops to a great extent the material and even cultural needs of man, from a society, to use a slogan, which delivers the goods to an ever larger part of the population. And that implies we are facing liberation from a society where liberation is apparently without a mass basis. We know very well the social mechanisms of manipulation, indoctrination, repression, which are responsible for this lack of a mass basis, which are responsible for the integration of the majority of the oppositional forces into the established social system. But I have to emphasize again that this is not merely an ideological integration, that it is not merely a surface integration, that it takes place precisely on the strong and rich basis which enables the society to develop and satisfy material and cultural needs better than before. Now, the knowledge of the mechanisms of manipulation, of repression, which goes down into the very unconscious of man, that is not the whole story. I believe that we, and I will use the we throughout my talk, I believe that we have to be too hesitant, that we have to be ashamed, understandably ashamed, to profess the integral, the radical features of a socialist society, its qualitative difference from all the established societies, its qualitative difference by virtue of which socialism is indeed and can be the definite negation of the established systems, no matter how productive, no matter how powerful they are or they may appear. In other words, and that is one of the many points where I disagree with Paul Goodman, our fault was not that we have been too immodest, but that we have been too modest. We have been too modest. We have, as it were, repressed a great deal of that, what we should have said and what we should have emphasized. If today these integral features, these truly radical features, which make a socialist society the definite negation of the existing societies, if this qualitative difference today appears as utopian, as idealistic, as metaphysical, this is precisely the form in which these radical features must appear if they are really to be the definite negation of the established societies, if socialism is indeed the rupture of history, the radical break, the leap into the realm of freedom, a total rupture. One illustration how this awareness or half awareness of the need for such a total rupture was present in some of the great social struggles of our period. Walter Benjamin quotes reports that during the Paris Commune, in all corners of the city of Paris, consciously or half-consciously, expressing the need that somehow time has to be arrested, that at least the prevailing, the established time continuum has to be arrested, and that a new time has to begin. A very strong emphasis on the qualitative difference and on the totality of the rupture between the new societies and the old. Now, in this sense, I should like to discuss here today with you the repressed prerequisites of qualitative change. I say intentionally of qualitative change, not of revolution, because we know of too many revolutions through which the continuum of repression has been sustained, which have replaced one system of domination by another system of domination. We must become aware of the essentially new features which distinguish a free society as the definite negation of the established societies, and we must begin formulating these features, no matter how metaphysical, no matter how utopian, I even say no matter how ridiculous, we may appear to the normal people in all camps, on the right as well as on the left. What is the dialectic of liberation with which we are here concerned? It is the construction of a free society, a construction which depends on the prevalence of the vital need for abolishing the established systems of servitude, and which depends, secondly, and that is decisive, on the vital commitment, the striving, conscious as well as sub and unconscious, for the qualitatively different values of a free human existence. Without the emergence of such new needs and satisfaction, the new needs and satisfaction of free men, all change in the social institutions, no matter how great, no matter how large, would only replace one system of servitude by another system of servitude. Now, nor can the emergence, and I should like to emphasize this, nor can the emergence of such new needs and satisfactions be envisaged as a mere byproduct, the mere result of changed social institutions. We have seen that. That is a fact of experience. For the development of the new institutions must already be carried out and carried through by men with the new needs. That is, by the way, the basic idea underlying Marx's own concept of the proletariat as a historical agent of revolution. He saw in the industrial proletariat the historical agent of revolution, not only because it was a basic class in the material process of production, not only because it was at that time the majority of the population, but also because this class was free from, in quotation marks, the repressive and aggressive competitive needs of capitalist society, and therefore, at least potentially, the carrier of essentially new needs, goals, and satisfactions. We can formulate this dialectic of liberation also in a more brutal way as a vicious circle. The transition from voluntary servitude, as it exists to a great extent in the affluent society, to freedom presupposes the abolition of the institutions and mechanisms of suppression, and the abolition of the institutions and mechanisms of suppression already presupposes liberation from servitude, prevalence of the need for liberation. As to the need, I think we have to distinguish between the need for changing intolerable conditions of existence and the need for changing the society as a whole. The two are by no means identical and are by no means in harmony. Quantitative change, if the need is for changing intolerable conditions of existence, with at least a reasonable chance that this can be achieved within the established society, with the growth and the progress of the established society. Quantitative change. Qualitative change, change of the very system as a whole. I would like to point out that the distinction between quantitative and qualitative change is not identical with the distinction between reform and revolution. Quantitative change can mean and can lead to revolution. Only the conjunction, I suggest, of these two is revolution in the essential sense of the leap from prehistory into the history of man. Or the problem with which we are faced is to determine the point where quantity can turn into quality, where the quantitative change in the conditions and institutions can become a qualitative change affecting the entire human existence. Today, the two potential factors of revolution, which I have just mentioned, are disjoint. The first is most prevalent in the undeveloped countries, where quantitative change, that is to say the creation of human living conditions, is in itself qualitative change, but is not yet freedom. The second potential factor of revolution, the prerequisites of liberation, are potentially there in the advanced industrial countries, but are contained and perverted by the capitalist organization of society. I think we are faced with a situation in which this advanced capitalist society has reached the point where quantitative change can technically be turned into qualitative change, into authentic liberation. And it's precisely against this truly fatal possibility that the affluent society, that advanced capitalism, is mobilized and organized on all fronts, in the interior as well as abroad. Before I go on, let me give you a brief definition of what I mean by an affluent society, a society which even in the United States is not yet entirely translated into reality. I would prefer to speak of tendencies here, but of course the model is the American society today. In the first place, it shouldn't be necessary to remind us of it. It is a capitalist society. It seems to be necessary because there are some people, even on the left, who believe that the American society is no longer a class society. I can assure you it is a class society. It is a capitalist society with a high concentration of economic and political power, with an enlarging sector of automation and coordination of production, distribution, and communication, with private ownership in the means of production, which, however, depends increasingly on ever more active and wide intervention by the government. It is a society in which, as I mentioned, the material as well as cultural needs of the underlying population are satisfied on a scale larger than before, but satisfied in line with the requirements and interests of the apparatus and of the powers which control the apparatus. And it is a society growing under conditions of accelerating waste, plant obsolescence and destruction, while the substratum of the population continues to live in poverty and misery. I believe that these factors are internally interrelated, that they make out the syndrome of late capitalism, namely the apparently inseparable unity, inseparable for the system, of productivity and destruction, of satisfaction of needs and repression, of liberty within a system of servitude, namely subjugation of man to the apparatus, and the inseparable unity of rational and irrational. We can say that the rationality of the society lies in its very insanity, and that the insanity of the society is rational to the degree to which it is efficient, to the degree to which it is efficient, to the degree to which it delivers the goods. Now the question we must raise is, why liberation from such a society, if it is capable of, perhaps in a long future, but apparently capable of conquering poverty to a greater degree than before, of reducing the toil of labor and the time of labor, and of raising the standard of living. Why liberation from such a society if the price for all the goods delivered, if the price for this comfortable servitude, for all these achievements, is exacted from people far away from the metropolis and far away from its affluence, if the affluent society itself hardly notices what it is doing, how it is spreading terror, enslavement, how it is fighting free liberation in all corners of the globe. We know the traditional weakness of emotional, moral, and humanitarian arguments in the face of such a technological achievement, in the face of the irrational rationality of such a power. These arguments do not seem to carry any weight against the brute facts, we can say brutal facts, of this society and its productivity. And yet, it is only the insistence on the real possibility of a free society, which is blocked by the affluent society. It is only this insistence in practice as well as in theory, in discussion as well as in demonstration, it is only this insistence which still stands in the way of the complete degradation of man to an object, or rather subject-object, of total administration. It is only this insistence which stands still in the way of the progressing brutalization and moronization of man. For, and I should like to emphasize it, the capitalist welfare state is a warfare state. It must have an enemy with a capital E, a total enemy, because the perpetuation of servitude, the perpetuation of the miserable struggle for existence in the very face of the new possibilities of freedom, this activates and intensifies in this society primary aggressiveness to a degree I think hitherto unknown in history, a primary aggressiveness which must be mobilized in socially useful ways, lest it explode the system itself. Therefore, the need of an enemy who must be there, and he must be created, even if he does not exist. Fortunately, I dare say the enemy does exist, but his image and his power must in the society be inflated beyond all proportions in order to be able to mobilize this aggressiveness of the affluent society in socially useful ways. The result is a mutilated, crippled and frustrated human existence, a human existence which is violently defending its own servitude. We can sum up the fatal situation with which we are confronted. Radical social change is objectively necessary. Objectively necessary in the dual sense that it is the only chance to save the possibilities of human freedom, and furthermore, in the sense that the technical and material resources for the realization of freedom are available. But while this objective need is demonstrably there, the subjective need for such a change does not prevail. Does not prevail precisely among those parts of the population which are traditionally considered the agents of historical change. The subjective need is suppressed, again on a dual ground, suppressed by virtue of the actual satisfaction of needs, and secondly, suppressed by a massive scientific manipulation and administration of needs, namely by a systematic social control not only of the consciousness but also of the unconscious of man. A control which has been made possible by the very achievements of the greatest liberating sciences of our time, in psychology, mainly psychoanalysis and psychiatry, that they could become at the same time powerful instruments of suppression. One of the most effective engines of suppression is again one of the terrible aspects of the dialectic of liberation. This situation, this divergence between the objective and the subjective need changes, I suggest, completely the basis, the prospects, and the strategy of liberation. Namely, this situation presupposes the emergence of new needs, qualitatively different and even the opposite of the prevailing aggressive and repressive needs. The emergence of a new type of man with the vital biological drive for liberation and with a consciousness capable of breaking through the material as well as ideological veil of the affluent society. In other words, liberation seems to be predicated upon the opening and the activation of a depth dimension of human existence, this side of and underneath the traditional material base. In other words, not an idealistic dimension over and above the material base, but a dimension even more material than the material base, a dimension underneath the material base. I will illustrate presently what I mean. The emphasis on this new dimension is not replacing politics by psychology, but rather the other way around. It is finally taking account of the fact that this society has invaded even the deepest roots of the individual existence, even the unconscious of man. That we must get at the roots of society in the individuals themselves, the individuals who, because of this social engineering, constantly reproduce the continuum of repression even through the great revolutions. Now this change is, I suggest, not an ideological change. It is dictated by the actual development of industrial society, which has introduced factors which our theory formerly could correctly neglect. It is dictated by the actual development of industrial society, by the tremendous growth of its material and technical productivity, which has surpassed and rendered obsolete the traditional goals and preconditions of liberation. Here we are faced with the question: is liberation from the affluent society identical with the transition from capitalism to socialism? The answer, I suggest, is it is not identical. If socialism is defined in terms merely of the planned development of the productive forces and the rationalization of resources, although this remains a precondition for all liberation. It is identical with the transition from capitalism to socialism if socialism is defined in its most utopian terms, namely, among others, the abolition of labor, the termination of the struggle for existence, that is to say, life as an end in itself and no longer as means for an end, and the liberation of human sensibility, sensitivity, as a force of transformation, not as a private factor, but as a force of transformation of the human existence and of its environment. To give sensitivity and sensibility their own right is, I think, one of the basic goals of integral socialism. These are the qualitatively different features of a free society. They presuppose, as you may have already seen, a total transvaluation of values, a new anthropology. They presuppose a type of man who rejects the performance principle governing the established societies. A type of man who has rid himself of the aggressiveness and brutality which are inherent in the organization of the established societies and in their hypocritical Puritan morality. A type of man which is biologically incapable of fighting wars and creating suffering. A type of man who has a good conscience of joy and pleasure, and who works collectively and individually for a social and natural environment in which such an existence becomes possible. The dialectic of liberation, as turn from quantity into quality, thus involves, I repeat, a break in the continuum of repression, which reaches into the depth dimension of the organism itself, or we can say that today, qualitative change, liberation, involves organic, instinctual, biological changes at the same time as political and social changes. The new needs and satisfactions have a very material basis. I indicated it. They are not thought out, I would like to claim. They are the logical derivation from the technical, material, and intellectual possibilities of advanced industrial society. They are inherent in and the expression of the productivity of advanced industrial society, which has long since made obsolete all kind of inner-worldly asceticism, the entire work discipline on which the Judeo-Christian morality has been based. While this society is surpassing and negating this type of man, the traditional type of man, and the forms of his existence, as well as the morality to which it owes much of its origins and foundations. This new, unheard of and not anticipated productivity allows the concept of a technology of liberation. A technology of liberation. And here I can only briefly indicate what I have in mind. Such amazing and indeed apparently utopian tendencies as the convergence of technique and art, the convergence of work and play, the convergence of the realm of necessity and the realm of freedom. How? No longer subjected to the dictate of capitalist profitability and of efficiency, no longer subject to the dictate of scarcity, today perpetuated by the capitalist organization of society, socially necessary labor, material production would and could become, we see the tendency already, increasingly scientific, technical experimentation, and science and technique would and could become a play with the hitherto hidden, methodically hidden, and blocked potentialities of men and things, of society and nature. This means one of the oldest dreams of all radical theory and practice. It means that the creative imagination, and not only the rationality of the performance principle, that creative imagination would become a productive force applied to the transformation of the social and natural universe. It would mean the emergence of a form of reality which is the work and the medium of the developing sensibility and sensitivity of man. And now I throw in the terrible concept. It would mean an aesthetic reality, society as work of art. This is the most utopian, the most radical possibility of liberation today. What does it mean concretely? I said we are not concerned here with private sensitivity and sensibility, but sensitivity and sensibility, creative imagination play becoming forces of transformation. As such, they would guide, for example, the total reconstruction of our cities and of the countryside, the restoration of nature after the elimination of the violence and destruction of capitalist industrialization, the creation of the internal and external space for privacy, individual autonomy, tranquility, the elimination of noise, of captive audiences, of enforced togetherness, of pollution, of ugliness. These are not, and I cannot emphasize it strongly enough, snobistic and romantic demands. Biologists today have emphasized that these are organic needs of the human organism, and that their arrest, their perversion and their destruction by capitalist society actually mutilates the human organism, not only in a figurative but in a very real and literal sense. I believe that only in such a universe men can be truly free, and truly human relationships between free beings can be established. I believe that the idea of such a universe guided also Marx's concept of socialism, and that these aesthetic needs and goals must from the beginning be present in the reconstruction of society, and not only at the end or in the far future. Otherwise, the needs and satisfactions which reproduce a repressive society would be carried over in the new society. Repressive men would carry over their repression into the new society. Now, at this farthest point, the question, how can we possibly envisage the emergence of such qualitatively different needs and goals as organic biological needs and goals, and not as superimposed values? How can we envisage the emergence of these needs and satisfaction within and against the established society, that is to say prior to liberation, that was the dialectic with which I started, that in a very definite sense we have to be free from in order to create a free society. Needless to say, the dissolution of the existing system is the precondition for such qualitative change, and the more total and the more efficient the repressive apparatus of the affluent societies operates, the less likely is the gradual transition from servitude to freedom. The fact that today we cannot identify any specific class or any specific group as revolutionary force, this fact is no excuse for not using any and every possibility and method for arresting the engines of repression in the individuals. To the total character of the advanced capitalist society corresponds precisely the diffusion of the potential opposition among the entire underlying population. The internal contradictions of the system are as grave as ever before and likely to be aggravated with the violent expansion of capitalist imperialism. The contradictions, not only the most general contradiction between the tremendous social wealth on the one hand and the destructive, aggressive and wasteful use of this wealth on the other, but far more concrete contradictions, such as the need, the necessity for the system to automate, the continued reduction of the human base in physical labor power in the material reproduction of society, thereby the tendency to the draining of the sources of surplus profit, and so on. These are real contradictions. Finally, the threat of technological unemployment, which even the most affluent society may no longer be capable of compensating by the creation of ever more parasitarian and unproductive labor. All these contradictions exist. As reaction and because of their contradiction, suppression, manipulation and integration are likely to increase. But the ferment is there. The ground can and must be prepared. The mutilated consciousness and the mutilated instincts must be broken. And the sensitivity and the awareness of the new transcending antagonistic values, they are there. And they are here, precisely among the non-integrated, the still non-integrated social groups, and among those who by virtue of their privileged position can pierce the ideological and material veil of mass communication and indoctrination, namely the intelligentsia. We all know the fatal prejudice against the intelligentsia as catalyst of historical change in the labor movement practically from the beginning. It is time to ask the question whether this prejudice against the intellectuals and the inferiority complex of the intellectuals resulting from it was not an essential factor in the development of the capitalist as well as socialist societies, in the development and weakening of the opposition. The intellectuals usually went out to organize the others, to organize in the communities. They certainly did not use the potentiality they had to organize themselves, to organize among themselves, not only on a regional, not only on a national, but on an international level. That is, in my view today, one of the most urgent tasks. Can we say that the intelligentsia is the agent of historical change? Can we say that the intelligentsia today is a revolutionary class? The answer I would give is no. We cannot say that. But we can say, and I think we must say, that the intelligentsia has a decisive preparatory function. Not more, and I suggest this is plenty. By itself it is not and cannot be a revolutionary class, but it can become the catalyst, and it has a preparatory function. Certainly not the first time in history. That's in fact the way all revolutions started, but more perhaps today than ever before. Because, and for that too, we have a very material and very concrete basis, because this group, it is this group from which the holders of decisive positions in the productive process will be recruited in the future even more than before. I refer to what we may call the increasingly becoming scientific or intellectualization of the material process of production, by virtue of which the role of the intelligentsia changes. It is a group from which the decisive holders of decisive positions will be recruited: scientists, researchers, technicians, engineers, even psychologists, because psychology will continue to be a socially necessary instrument, either of servitude or of liberation. This class, this intelligentsia, has been called the new working class. I believe this term is at best premature. They are, and that we should not forget, today the pet beneficiaries of the established system. But they are also at the very source of the glaring contradiction between the liberating capacity of science and its repressive and enslaving use.
You've been listening to Herbert Marcuse speaking on liberation from the affluent society.